Welcome to all of you. This is the third of our event in the summer series we're calling Dismantling Structural Racism. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at the College of the Holy Cross, and I'm delighted to serve as host for the series, including today's event featuring Jerry Dickinson of the Holy Cross class of 2009 on housing policy and the well-being of Black and Brown people in America. Welcome to everyone who's joining us, and I'll mention that recordings of these, we're going to record this, and that recordings of all three of the discussions, the two we had before with Malik Neal and Rashonda Tyson, should all be posted fairly shortly for others to see. The recent tragic killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and others this year have rightly stirred outrage across the world and have mobilized considerable new resolve to work on anti-racism initiatives and for social and structural changes that directly impact the lives of Black and Brown people. The memorial events this weekend, last few days, to mark the life of Congressman John L. Lewis really served to me as a stark reminder of how long the path has been to overcome the impact of slavery and Jim Crow policies, and how incomplete that remains, despite the progress that we've had. As I've thought about how we educate Holy Cross students, I've been really focused on asking what it takes to channel the willpower of the moment into lasting, sustainable change. And among the best examples of how to do that I could think of to put before our students are three alumni who've been presenting in the series, young people who are already working hard to bring about that change. So even in July, while the momentum is strong, I'm hoping that we can harness what these alums know and build on the momentum of the moment, momentum that's possible, as I say, only because of tragic deaths like those of George Floyd and many more men and women before him. Jerry Dickinson of the class of '09, Jerry's interest in housing policy stems back to his years as a Holy Cross student and were sharpened during a Fulbright fellowship in South Africa, is here to help us do that today. A decade after his graduation, I'm delighted to be able to call him Professor Jerry Dickinson. He's recently promoted to associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh Law School, and to note that he was a candidate for US Congress this year, not successfully, but in what we like to call his first run for Congress. And he was just telling us how helpful Holy Cross alum were in fundraising for that. Alumni were part of that. In the discussion that we have today, we'll work to make sure that we have time for questions, particularly from students, but from anyone who would like to ask them. And I'll ask you if you'd use the Q&A function for those. I'd say early on, perhaps, to save some questions we have for questions that are about clarification, if we use some term or idea that you don't mean, but I promise that we will open it up, and I hope that you'll have some really good questions for us. I hope that with Jerry, we can talk about housing as a structural issue that affects people of color, their well-being, their life chances, and also step inside some personal examples that Jerry's seen in his work as an advocate. So welcome, Jerry.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me.
You don't have to call me professor anymore, but I noticed you haven't stopped doing that, so there you go. Yeah. So a lot of the attention in the moment really has been on police reform. Why have you been passionately committed to housing reform? And maybe take us through a little bit and tell us, is this a distraction in our series? Is it something that's largely taken care of, that's not so urgent? Maybe we could put this aside until we get through some of the more urgent challenges that people are on the streets about? Or how do we think about this in terms of long-term impact on Black and Brown people?
Sure. No, I think that it's not a distraction. It's actually, it's connected and intertwined, in fact, with the ongoing police reform protests as a result of George Floyd. And, I think back to, my own personal experience of why housing is so important. I came up out of the foster care system in the Pittsburgh area. The idea of shelter, or at least having a safe space, has been, internalized for me in many ways. And so, but that same protection, the need for space and shelter, expands beyond the foster care system, expands to all facets of life. And so, I think what's happening now in this country, one can draw a parallel with housing and police conduct and police brutality against Black and brown bodies. We can think of this in terms of thinking back to Michael Brown and Ferguson and the killing of yet another Black man back in 2014, I believe, And, you know, they're in a suburban Ferguson area, which is in many ways segregated neighborhood, right, along housing lines, right? And so you have an issue where police forces, many of them predominantly white, are in many ways overseeing and regulating Black and brown communities. And given structural racism in this country, and subconscious racism as well that are internalized by police officers, we have that connection where segregation gives rise to continuous police brutality against Black and brown bodies. And so I think there's a connection there that oftentimes can be drawn out and talked about. And I think this is a great opportunity to do that. So the two are connected.
And you raise out, I think of Ahmaud Arbery too, sort of being in a neighborhood where he didn't belong. When you come down to housing and housing policies and segregation, it's what made somebody in a twisted way think that was somehow sensible to have done.
That's right. And you know, yeah, and you have that dynamic of police oftentimes stopping and asking questions to those who look different in a particular setting and or neighborhood. And so, but that questioning oftentimes turns into violence, right? Stop and frisk policies that end up resulting in oftentimes the death of Black and brown bodies. And that's precisely oftentimes a result of a person of color being in a place where police perceive them to be threatening when, of course, they're not. Yeah.
Can you take us through a little history? I know you know this well. Take us just through a little history from Jim Crow era or whatever, housing in America, and what has it had to do with race, housing policy?
Yeah, sure. I teach an upper level course in land, race, and property rights at the University of Pittsburgh alongside teaching constitutional law and property. And so I walk my students through a bit of history of how property rights and housing are directly, or at least race directly affects that, all the way back to thinking to the New Deal era and post World War II, where massive expansion of home ownership, subsidies and programs from the federal government in many ways facilitated white flight from the cities, right? This idea that you could build and provide subsidies for homeownership opportunities, but oftentimes those subsidies and access to those types of homeownership opportunities were only for white Americans, working class. And so initially for veterans, but then obviously it permeated into a much larger racialized housing policy that was influenced by the federal government. And then you have the private sector also then playing a role in segregating America, right? You have the realty industry, which is actually, in many ways, affirmatively trying to push African-American homeowners into segregated enclaves, right? And that's the private sector is actually now working in tandem with the federal government to ensure segregation continues, even though in many ways segregation has been outlawed in certain parts of the country. So you have this unique history, this back and forth between government and private, unconstitutional actions at the end of the day, equal protection concerns that are permeating American society. And you can see it today. The results are that you have many American cities and suburbs that are still segregated as a result of those experiences and of those policies. And so, that's a huge issue that, we're concerned about, and, the effects of that are here. Yep.
So, step back. If I think of the house I grew up in Connecticut and many others where I am, I'm feeling a little older, but not that old, but many of those policies had clauses that were in it about who houses could be sold to, period, that Black and brown people or Jews or other people, Catholics in some places, that their house literally could not be conveyed to a person of color. So how recently were those eliminated legally?
Yeah, we're talking about racially restrictive covenants, as you're alluding to here. And these are provisions that are actually fixated into deeds, and they prohibit the sale of a piece of property to a certain subset, a group of people. And of course, that's used to racialize and segregate neighborhoods. And you have that aspect of it, but then you also have racial zoning back in the 1940s and 1950s, where you essentially, the cities are zoned based off of your race, and you can't purchase a piece of property in a particular zone if you are African American, for example. And those laws, in many ways, were not struck down on equal protection grounds, i.e., violating someone's rights based off their race. oftentimes those laws were struck down based off of contract law. And so, even our legal system in many ways has, and legal doctrine has attempted to avoid the race question, right? And to kind of circumvent it in order to bring us to a more just society. And that's a really interesting, I think, part of law in America, is that oftentimes what is directly a race-related issue isn't treated as one by our courts and by our legislatures.
So you mentioned the New Deal, the origins of public policy. I imagine for a lot of students, if they think about public housing, they think about it as housing for largely Black and brown people who lived there. A little bit of the history on that, where they came from, how they were treated.
Sure. I'll take a few minutes just to talk about, the initial origins of public housing, often for veterans, war veterans who are coming back home to the United States, and this idea that the government had an affirmative obligation to provide housing. And of course, over time, while housing is provided, public housing is provided, the federal government realizes that it can also provide similar housing as a way to segregate African Americans in particular, but just Black and brown communities from white America. And so slowly but surely, you started to see the gradual segregating of our communities, the building of public housing in predominantly African American neighborhoods, the use of eminent domain, right? The idea that the government can seize private property for some public use. Well, the government would say affordable housing is a public use. We're going to strip people of their property and build affordable housing. But of course, that housing was in concentrated Black neighborhoods. And so that's used over time, and it's entrenched into our understanding of how housing is built and produced in this country. And the results today are illuminating, as I mentioned before, with segregated cities that in many ways have pockets of enclaves of segregation that don't provide for a whole lot of mobility, social mobility, economic mobility out of those neighborhoods.
So people were steered into those. We'll talk about also policy, as you mentioned initially, policies that pushed wealthier white people out to the suburbs and subsidized that. In fact, that happened for them. And finally, maybe redlining, if kids aren't aware about redlining.
Sure, yeah, the redlining of particular neighborhoods for purposes of, well, really real estate agents, right? And this idea that, certain neighborhoods are cut and carved out, and you don't want to be sending and showing potential home ownership opportunities to African Americans in predominantly white neighborhoods, right? And of course, while those laws in many ways have been outlawed, they still operate under the radar and in a very quiet, private way that it's hard to detect. And the courts over time have tried to set up these doctrines where you have disparate impact theory. So the idea that even though the federal government may not be intentionally attempting to segregate, the very effects of the segregation in and of itself is a cause of action. That is, that the federal government can be held liable for the production of affordable housing if it's, placed in segregated neighborhoods. So we're coming a long way, of course, but there's still a lot of work to be done to unravel this entrenched system of racism in our housing market. Can
you say anything how that's contributed to any sort of you can think certainly schools have been determined by where you live, so schools are an outcome of that. Income inequality, sort of just spell out some of the ways that's concretely impacted people of color a generation or two later. Are we just talking about history, or is this something that's still reverberating generation?
It's still reverberating. I think you mentioned education. I think there's a really interesting connection there between education, segregation, and housing, and that has to do with local zoning laws. One of the most effective ways that America has segregated or continued to segregate based off of housing is how our zoning ordinances are set up. And that is a suburban municipality, it's all across the United States, will oftentimes make it extremely difficult for multifamily residential housing to be built in their neighborhoods. That is housing that would typically be for rent. And the idea here is that it's not explicitly race-based. It's not saying that we're going to exclude a group of people based off of their race from the neighborhood, from the municipality, but the very act of prohibiting multifamily residential development in and of itself excludes many times African American and Latino families who are looking and accessing rental properties. And this is all across the United States. It's here in Pittsburgh. It's also up there in Worcester and Boston. And it's I would say, legally clever way to institutionalize this type of racism, because you have municipalities that have plenty of homeownership opportunity that go to middle-class white families, but because rental opportunities are not available, you have a dearth of housing for African Americans, Latinos. That's one of many, many ways that this is continuing to entrench race and housing segregation.
And then in terms of wealth across generations, there are disparities of income between Black and white people in America, but there are much larger disparities of wealth, and some of those have to do, as they resonate across generations. Most of the wealth that people did accumulate was what they saved in their house, and if you weren't able to buy a house in an area where you built up wealth, you weren't getting that to pass along to your kids to create.
Yep. Yeah, as you mentioned, one of the biggest wealth gaps, of course, between whites and blacks is the idea that access to home ownership, right, and not being able to invest, and then also being able to, say, hand down that piece of property, that home ownership, that investment, that equity to family members. And right now, as a law professor at Pitt, while I teach and do research and writing, a lot of my work is working alongside community groups to increase wealth building opportunities through home ownership. And so right now I actually work with a community group in a mostly impoverished African American neighborhood to create what we call a community land trust. And so this idea that nonprofit organizations can actually own property, right? These are homes, right? But then also they can restrict the resale price of the home to ensure that it remains affordable for decades on end. And so what that does is it allows those who would otherwise be unable to own a home, many of them in the neighborhood, African American families, it drives down the cost of the house to a point where African American families can afford it, and then obviously pass it off generation to generation to generation, instead of allowing developers or investors to buy up these pieces of property, sell them at above market rate, and then of course, drive up gentrification and displacement in our neighborhoods. So there's all these kind of, unique grassroots mechanisms through the law that kind of allow us to push for more home ownership and equity building opportunities for Black and brown communities.
So I think public housing, it's been through a whole kind of series of things. We had enormous housing complexes, Pruitt-Igoe, other places. Then we wrecked those. We called those a failure. We've tried some rebuilding in some ways where we've, originally they were failures because they just locked people of color or poor people away. We were going to spread people out. And so you remember all this wealth.
Yeah.
How do you think about public housing now? Do you find hope in some of the experiments that happened after that, sort of rebuilding mixed use public housing? Is that where you put your hope, or what's?
Yeah, I mean, there's some of that. Right now, I think and this is under a number of administrations, all the way from Carter to Reagan to Bush to Clinton to Obama. And for the most part, many of those administrations have been hands off in terms of building public housing. It's been marketization, privatization. It's actually, selling off some of these properties to private developers or private management companies to deal with. And that doesn't necessarily fix the segregation problem in America. And so one of the things that I think is increasingly important is that local governments have to start instituting certain ways that force developers, right? Because that's where we're at right now in this world of housing. A significant amount of it is forcing developers to actually produce below market affordable units in these new densely populated areas in the cities. We can see this across the board in terms of what we call inclusionary zoning policies. That is, if you're a developer coming into a city and you're going to build a 100 apartment unit complex, well, local municipalities need to start mandating that 30% or 40% of those units are below market. Maybe they're Section 8 voucher units, right, to allow. And that also then I think in many
Can you
ways.
tell people what Section 8 vouchers are?
What's that?
Can you tell people what Section 8 vouchers are?
Yeah, Section 8 vouchers is just a government program dating all the way back to, I think, the Nixon administration that actually it defrays the cost of housing. It's a voucher and it's attached to a tenant. So the tenant can, has portability, can go to different landlords in a city and rent. But it essentially guarantees the landlord a certain percentage of the rents from the federal government. So it defrays the cost for the tenant, allows the tenants to live in places where they may otherwise not be able to do it. But those types of policies in collaboration with some of these other privatized development projects, I think are really important in America right now. That being said, in light of the pandemic, some of that, I think, policy concept has been flipped upside down. In other words, you have vast deprivation in terms of people's ability to pay rent, right? To actually even pay their mortgage on their home. And that now then raises I think a reality, which is what role does the federal government now have in times of crisis where housing is perhaps affordable housing is not as accessible as it used to be. And so, a lot of questions now in terms of, does the federal government go back to a far more robust, direct role in building public housing, while at the same time not making the same mistakes they used to make in terms of segregating along race lines?
So would you advocate a more robust role?
In light of the pandemic right now, yes, because the role of the development industry in the building associations is profit making, right? Right now, those industries are not in a position to serve as a role to build housing as a social good. It's a commodity, right, for the private industry. And so as long as it's a commodity for the private industry, it's never going to be seen as a social good. And so the federal government has to intervene, given the situation we have right now of vast and historic levels of inequality and deprivation of housing.
So, it seems to me the government has two options. One is sort of build it ourselves, or the second, the policy has been sort of incentivized, as you were talking about. So
That's
when
right.
you look at the incentives, are they, the ones we've tried, are they misplaced, foolish? Are they well-intentioned, but people have worked around it? I mean, so talk to me about the policy incentives and how they've worked.
Yeah, there is some intention behind it, but I think a lot of it is unintentional. I think back to, or not even think back, even right now, most recently, certain rule changes amongst HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, and this idea that they want to pull back the incentives for local municipalities to loosen their land use restrictions, right? Well, that's maybe not a good thing. We want to incentivize local municipalities to loosen their land use restrictions to be able to build more affordable housing, right? And so there's some tweaking that has to be done there. At the same time, because the federal government over time has left it to the states to build affordable housing and had some strings attached with some dollars here and some dollars there, given budgets for states, it's very difficult to keep up with the housing production. And so with that in mind, I think the federal government now especially is going to have to insert themselves far more affirmatively to be able to produce more affordable housing within their resource constraints. And I remember when I was on a Fulbright to South Africa, and this was a huge question within the South African courts and also legislature, because there was a right to access to housing under the South African Constitution. There's actual right to the housing on demand, right? You have a right to have this. And the question became all the resources that the government would have to expend to provide and to exercise that right. We don't have that situation here in the United States where you have a right to housing. And so really it's an entitlement. It's treated as an entitlement. And as a result of that, the government has to do a whole lot more work to be able to produce the housing equitably.
Bring us to the make me think of the question about the degree of homelessness in America.
Yeah.
Are there kinds of policies you see? Do you see racial disparities in terms of homelessness? Is it largely an issue of many people point to mental illness? Certainly, there are housing prices, mental illness difficulties. You see racial disparities in terms of homelessness in America?
Yes, there's certainly, in my experiences as an advocate, as a lawyer, actually representing tenants who oftentimes would be rendered homeless if they were evicted from their homes. And, anecdotally, almost every single client that I have represented in housing court or even in federal fair housing litigation has been African American or Latino. And that disparity, I think, is extremely telling, just in terms of the number of people that I've had to deal with this. And that, kind of goes back to this question of eviction and homelessness. If you are, and there's studies that show this, Matthew Desmond is the most recent ethnographer and sociologist who talks about the connection between eviction and homelessness. But African American single mothers are the most disadvantaged in the housing market today, and will continue to be unless we make fundamental changes to our housing policy. And that is just by having children and by being Black or Latino, the power structure of the housing market is that most of those who hold land and they're white landowners, most of them white men. That power dynamic between the tenant and that white property owner has internal racialized bias. And so when push comes to shove, when rent can't be paid by a single mother with children, when her children may, break the lease agreement by engaging in some type of criminal activity or whatever it may be, they're far more apt to be evicted at higher rates than their white counterparts. And as a result of that, we see a significant cycle of African American women, especially, into homelessness, and then cycling from what we call street homelessness, then into sheltered homelessness. And then it's a vicious cycle that lands, I think, many African American women in deep, deep levels of concentrated poverty that it's extremely difficult to get out of. We see that here in the Pittsburgh area, where African American women is one of the least livable places for African American women. And that housing dynamic that I just talked about is readily apparent. And as I said before, most of my clients have been African American women who have been affected by this power dynamic in the housing market. And, obviously the question becomes, well, what has to be done from a policy standpoint to change that dynamic? And that's a very complicated question. But anyways, that's kind of the history there between eviction and homelessness that we deal with, that I deal with, and that we see all across the United States.
So it helps me. So it's more a sociological question I'm thinking of. But when you're dealing with all of these cases, you've got on the one hand what seem like, as you work with these women or others, personal troubles and personal stories that lead to this. How do you connect in your mind those kind of all those personal narratives when you get to structural problems? Is there a big gap? Do they just seem like a pile of personal terrible stories that we don't know how to take care of? Or are there ways that you really see the policies that we're looking at contribute to those personal troubles? That's an interesting question. And I'll give an example of this. In about 5 years ago, I represented a young African-American woman. She was probably about 20 years of age. And she lived in public housing here in Pittsburgh. And at the time, she was, and again, segregated public housing, right? Extremely segregated in the city of Pittsburgh. At the time, she was a drug runner for a gang, right? 20 years of age, young, needed access to some money, source of money, was doing this. She got caught, ended up getting convicted for a drug-related crime, whatever it may be. Now, under public housing policy, typically under a lease agreement, any drug-related criminal activity is grounds for eviction. Well, the Public Housing Authority never found out about it. So she continued to live in the public housing unit for years on end. She reformed herself. She did all the things that the court required her to do to redeem herself, right? All that stuff. 3 or 4 years later, the Housing Authority then finds out about this prior conviction and seeks to evict her. Well, by this time, the young woman is now pregnant. She's about to become a mother. And the Housing Authority still wants to kick her out as a result of that past crime. Right?
This is one example of this story of this young African-American woman entangled in this larger structural problem of public housing being built, segregated in certain areas, lack of access to job opportunities, right? So her access to money was really obviously through the drug trafficking, underground engagement in criminal activity, is indicative of the larger problem, structural problems we're seeing with housing in America. Now, what was very interesting about this litigation that I was representing this tenant was that at the time she was being evicted, she was also applying for a Section 8 voucher, which we just talked about, another form of government subsidy to then allow her to get out of public housing, to go live somewhere, say in a suburban area where there are more resources available, right? Maybe better education, right? Closer access to jobs, right? Transportation, other such things. She knew she wanted to get out of there, right? And she was taking the steps to get that Section 8 voucher from the government to then be able to move out. And she inevitably was able to do it. We were able to keep her in her unit. She wasn't kicked out and wasn't rendered to homelessness. And she got her Section 8 voucher and she finally was able to move. And I still stay in contact with her today. She's a mother, her daughter's beautiful, all that stuff. So fine, romanticized story of sorts, but you can see all the different elements of the problems of some of our housing policy just within that one particular case. And so, yes, there is a direct connection, and you can see kind of the broader structural problems there just within that one story.
When we were talking before we got on with the group, you mentioned William Julius Wilson and the truly disadvantaged. So way back in the day, we'd read Wilson, and it was unimaginable to think it was changing then. But at one time, the story of cities was about hollowed out places where jobs and opportunity had moved to the suburbs. It was about, I know people supposedly in the 70s were buying row houses in parts of Boston for several thousands of dollars each, right? But it was the emptiness of the cities was the problem. And, we live in a place now where, and I suspect Pittsburgh is somewhat the same, where everyone's moved back into the cities, or wealthy people have moved back into the cities, and housing prices. So it seems like we have the opposite problem that we had before. Does it make you think any differently about housing policy, about inequality? So many cities are just doing great, and the problem is who can afford $2,500 a month for the first apartment that I lived in Boston, a third floor, no parking, et cetera, $500,000 to buy it as a condo. It's astounding what's happened in some of these places.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that is, and I like to think of this as you said, the out-migration theory by William Julius Wilson, but also now we're dealing with what we call maybe an in-migration theoretical problem. That is that the government hasn't kept up with, and the housing market hasn't kept up with these economic transformations outward from a production-oriented economy in our cities, outward into the suburbs to a service sector-oriented economy. Now, 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, we have this inward migration of sorts. And again, the housing market hasn't yet adapted to that. It's adapted to market rate development for young professionals, or professionals generally speaking, coming into the cities, many of them being white. But while that process is happening in Pittsburgh, right, this new urbanism of sorts, we don't have the structural policies in place to mitigate the damage that's being caused. And when I say damage, that is gentrification and displacement, right? All those who have been left behind that William Julius Wilson talked about, many of them remain and are still here. They're Black and brown communities who are struggling just to get by in these inner city enclaves. And so in Pittsburgh and Boston and other places, what we see is the cost of housing rising, land values rising, and that's causing landlords to up the rent. That's causing pieces of property to be sold in predominantly poor African American neighborhoods. Pieces of property sold at $400,000, $500,000, right, for new townhomes and development. And what I'm seeing now is that the question becomes, where do they go? Right? I mean, when we're tracking some of this in the city of Pittsburgh, we're losing our Black population somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people a year as a result of this inward migration of sorts. And we're seeing that many people are leaving the state. They're actually heading elsewhere to other big cities that may have more amenable opportunities. And that's a huge, huge, huge concern. And, with my work as an advocate, as a lawyer, we're seeing this happen. I mentioned I represent a community group, and we actually run research on all the new sales of properties over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years in this particular neighborhood to get a sense of what's happening, the market's destabilization. And it's extraordinary. You have investors from outside of the state, from California or New York, whatever it may be. They come into the city of Pittsburgh, they buy up vacant land or vacant properties, they rehab them and they build them, and then they, of course, so you see this in these pockets of these neighborhoods. Right now, much of the policy that's being implemented to actually mitigate this is these grassroots efforts, these community land trusts of sorts, right? But that's not enough, right? So when you talk about, has this made you rethink housing policy? It has. It has made me think that, part of how we're going to have to tackle this issue is not just, grassroots level housing, nonprofit related development, but it's going to have to be imposing mandatory requirements on developers at the local level, and then layer that with a significant number of federal, subsidies and housing to close the gap. I think we're getting there, but it's slow process with housing in America on these related issues.
Professor Jim Nikoloff asks, if there is an example of a well-integrated city, what would be a good example of a well-integrated city in the U.S., if there are any? And if there are some, how did that come to be?
Yeah, if there are some well-integrated cities across the United States, and I'm trying to think to myself of past history of integrated. One example, I think, and it's not a huge city of sorts, but Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Now, I know most people always say, well, Mount Laurel, wait a minute. Well, it's at the intersection of Camden and New York City and on the East Coast there. But I raise Mount Laurel as an example of a more kind of exurb or suburban city of sorts. And I think that has some promise for how we want to foresee our housing policy, is that back in the 70s, Mount Laurel was in the middle of what became national news, major exclusionary zoning litigation. And I mentioned this earlier, right? Predominantly white suburban Mount Laurel, excluding multifamily residential development. Why? Because African Americans were migrating from Camden into Mount Laurel. Why? Because there were job opportunities, it was perhaps safer. And as a result of the litigation that happened with regards to Mount Laurel, which never made it to the federal courts, it was strictly within state courts, the state Supreme Court of New Jersey actually took on an affirmative role. The judiciary took on an affirmative role to impose affordable housing requirements on a municipality. In other words, integration requirements from the judiciary, which oversaw and enforced it, right? Very, unique in and of itself. That hasn't been replicated in other parts of the country because of how politically volatile it is for the judiciary to actually enforce many housing policies. But as a result of that, and there were updated sociological studies that were done in Mount Laurel as recently as I think 4 or 5 years ago. They have one of the highest rates, I think, of integration among suburban areas in the United States. And so I think that example in and of itself, I think, is one way to look at this. Now, it may be pie in the sky to think that other jurisdictions throughout the United States can tell the state courts to actually oversee housing, but where you do have that kind of overt regulation of the housing market, you do see some benefits as well. So,
at some level, how well integrated they are, how it affects housing. You think of places like Queens or parts of Los Angeles, so, extraordinary diversity, 70, 80 languages spoken within a zip code, or, that students within a school are. So in some ways there is, how well it works is a question that we want to look at, and it's certainly that people are living in pockets. You mentioned courts in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Lawrence Rosani wants to know if there are any significant SCOTUS decisions that influence housing policy. And in some ways, maybe the way you framed it, a lot of things affect housing, but...
Yeah. Well, I'd say about 4 years back was a SCOTUS decision.
Supreme Court decisions, for those who aren't into...
what's that?
Supreme
Supreme Court.
Yes,
Supreme
for people
Court.
who are not into...
The
just
Supreme
to clarify for our audience.
The Supreme Court of the United States, no, we wouldn't say the Constitutional Court, that's in South Africa, but the Supreme Court had recently, and I say recently, usually typically within the last 5 to 6 years, handed down a decision that I think is, and it was Justice Kennedy who handed down this decision, and this is with regards to, as I mentioned earlier, cases involving discrimination. And the crux of the case dealt with what we call low-income housing tax credits. This is an idea that, through tax abatements and other forms of subsidies, we can incentivize developers to build housing in the inner cities, right? Well, what we found, at least as part of this case, a significant number of those tax credits were being granted and approved for developers who were building in concentrated Black and brown communities, right? So they, what was otherwise should have been used for dispersing housing and desegregating, the policy was being used to facilitate more and more segregation. Now, the question became whether or not the federal government and these developers, whether they intentionally were doing this. And that was the question. Well, can we find them to be liable? Yes, we can. If they intentionally did this, then yes, of course, they can be liable for and found for equal protection claims and other violations of the Constitution. However, the more difficult question was where you couldn't find any motive, or they were doing it, or there was no intent, right? There was no motive behind it. The question became, can you still find the government liable for those types of discriminatory actions? And the Supreme Court and Justice Kennedy found that you could. We call this disparate impact theory. That is, you don't need to prove intent and motive. All you have to prove is causation. You have to prove that the housing policy created enclaves of segregation and concentrated poverty. That in and of itself means that the government should have known that its policy was causing this problem. And so that's an important case. Lots of litigation now as a result of that. And what it does is, in many ways, it does make the federal government, it forces the federal government to rethink how it distributes those types of subsidies to developers. It makes them rethink and say, wait a minute, we need to be sure that we're not contributing to concentrated poverty and segregation. We need to be sure that we're not actually playing a role in that, because if we are, then we're going to be subject to litigation, right? There's a justiciable claim to go into federal court and to say that the government has engaged in this type of activity. And so really an important decision. So, we're making inroads. And as we're learning here in this discussion, there's these levels of legislative action that can be taken to ameliorate race and housing problems. The courts at the federal and state level playing a role in this as well. And then, community-based grassroots level organizing to push for housing change as well.
John Larson, one of our students who is doing with other students, a lived history of COVID project with history department and some great students, has a question related to COVID. He says, you already touched on that, but maybe you can discuss some strategies you believe could help increase affordable housing access amid the COVID-19 economic crisis. And I'd say you talked about building, but that's kind of a long-term strategy. Short and medium terms, the next 6-9 months, a year.
In terms of building affordable housing, or just
impact of COVID and how you ameliorate that?
Yeah, there's a number of things that have happened across the states. One is moratoriums on eviction, but then also moratoriums on the actual ability to pay rent, right? The actual government stepping in saying that for those who can't pay rent, they can't pay rent. You can't be evicted for this particular issue. That is an interesting start to this, but it raises a more fundamental question. That is, and I mentioned this before, housing is a social good, right? And the government stepping in and actually playing a role. So you have the moratorium question and issue. On the more short term, and this is very interesting, I met with a community group organization. It's called the Tenants Residential Union here in Pittsburgh. And I met with them because amidst my studies on emergency powers, constitutional law related stuff, I found that under state emergency laws, those who, they have disaster emergency declarations that they can use, these are statutes on the books that governors can invoke. Well, under the Pennsylvania emergency statute and many others across the state, it actually permits the governor to waive all kinds of requirements for developers to build affordable housing. It permits the governor to take monies out of certain budgetary areas of the state legislature and to essentially call for the building of temporary housing as a result of the emergency. Now, typically, these are going to be used during natural disasters such as hurricanes and other such things. However, when I met with this community group and explained to them that this is one way to advocate for more temporary housing is to actually utilize this emergency declaration, this statute, to build some affordable housing. And the question obviously becomes, what about the permanency of that? And I said, well, that's a question later on down the line, but more importantly, right now, that's one way to interpret the law to say we are in a natural disaster through a pandemic. People don't have access to housing. They can't pay their rent, right? They're being evicted from their homes. Therefore, the government should be intervening through these statutory mechanisms. So that's one interesting example that hasn't been talked about recently.
Professor Saraloria wants to know what you think of Elizabeth Warren's housing bill. Is it realistic to think it could pass, and what would that take?
No, I'm trying to think.
Doing Congress, so.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to think through. I was fixated on Senator Booker's and Senator Kamala Harris's housing bills, and so I actually was not as privy to Elizabeth Warren's as a result of that. But I will say this, from a congressional standpoint, and in running for Congress myself, there's a significant amount that can be done. The problem is obviously political will. So when I was running for Congress, we ran on a social justice, racial justice platform, which included affordable housing. Oftentimes people don't think of Congress playing a role in that, but there's a role to be played, obviously. And one of those things I think is really interesting is this idea of, and Warren may have had elements of this, but I know Senator Harris and Senator Booker did, and that is this idea of renter refundable tax credits, right? So we think about, fundamentally, we have a conception of property in America that incentivizes home ownership. And we subsidize and we provide benefits to those, particularly at the end of the year through taxes, right? Some tax incentives as a result of being a home owner. But we don't provide those same types of benefits and subsidized resources to renters, at the federal level. The question becomes, well, why don't I get a tax break or some money back at the end of the year as a renter, like homeowners do, right? And there are theoretical questions, of course, that can be untangled to answer that question. But more to the point is that Congress can implement some type of renter refundable tax credit through the IRS and to provide money for those who are paying more than 25% of their household annual income on rent. And so we can see that as a way to assist those who are just scraping by, right, to pay for basic goods and needs, including housing. And as housing costs rise in particularly in the inner cities, the ability to be able to take that tax credit at the end of the year and get some money back is extremely important. So that's just one example of many things that can be done at the federal level, the congressional level for this. The other thing I think is really interesting is this idea of a right to counsel. So throughout the United States, and this has elements of affordable housing in it, you have a right under the Constitution, a right to some form of representation and counsel in a criminal proceeding. However, in a civil proceeding, such as an eviction related to housing, you do not have a right to counsel. You don't have a right to an attorney. There are some jurisdictions, such as New York, that have passed local laws that require you to have counsel if you're being evicted from your home. But for the most part, all across the United States, 97%, 98% of tenants are not represented by counsel. That, of course, results in more evictions, more homelessness, dealing with the affordable housing question. At the federal level, Senator Booker, and I think there have been some agreement with Senator Warren on this as well, which is the federal government either would incentivize local municipalities to provide counsel for those who are being evicted from their homes, or they would actually commandeer the states to require some form of a statutory right to legal counsel at the federal level, which would go down to the states. Very interesting dynamic, politically volatile, of course, like many of these policies, but unique, creative, and innovative ways to start thinking about ways to ameliorate some of these housing-related problems.
Cool. So as you know better than any of us, we're coming up on an election year. If you're focusing on housing issues, where, some people say all the change that happens that's good right now with a frozen, dysfunctional Congress is at the city level. That's where a lot of experimentation is. Like, would you focus on the presidential election a lot? How would you tell people in terms of levels of government really to pay attention to, you have to pay attention to all those levels? Is it foolish to think you can just fix things locally without big federal money?
Yeah. So, and I'll answer that by intertwining some of the constitutional law research and writing that I do. And one thing, we look back at history of major catastrophes, emergencies, or crises in American history, right? Everywhere from the Civil War upwards to the Great Depression, to other such things. With those major crises typically follow major transformational change in American political order in some way, shape, or form. The Great Depression obviously ushered in the New Deal, which massive governmental intervention in many, many aspects of American life, right? And as a result of that, as we talked about here, major government programs to facilitate home ownership. Now, we talked about the racialized dynamic of that, which was clearly problematic. But I say that by saying that here we are at a crossroads in American history where this idea of the Reagan regime, this marketization, deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, it's not working. It's untangling, it's unraveling before our eyes. Trump is just kind of the last aspect, savior of that regime. But that regime is ending. And the pandemic has exacerbated this movement away from the Reagan regime. It's exacerbated in a way where I think this catastrophe is going to force us into kind of what I would say a new deal order of massive governmental intervention. We have Republicans in Congress who are agreeing to historic levels of governmental intervention in our lives. And they're forced to do it. There's no other way around it. They can't. Right? 50, 40 million people who are unemployed, they cannot ignore that, right? So they're going to be forced ideologically to shift, and it's exacerbated. It's now moving even quicker. With that being said, I think there's an opportunity now to add housing as an addendum, but not as an addendum, actually put it front and center. And by saying that what we did with the New Deal post-Great Depression and the problems that were caused by it, by the racialization of it, we can now correct that this time around as a result of the pandemic. Utilize the pandemic, the crisis, as a way to say, look, we have a massive housing problem. Governmental intervention has to be part of this, and the federal government, more so than ever, has to play a role. And Professor Landy, you had mentioned that, as a state, local government, there are elements of that have to be part of this. But now, after 20, 30 years of a Reagan regime where the federal government has not been involved in housing, now is the time to shift back the pendulum to the federal government to play a more outsized role in housing. And I would say outsized role in housing and the economy and healthcare and other such things as well. But housing is an opportunity to do that. So
great. You're not that long out of Holy Cross. If you put yourself back as a sophomore or something, what would you tell your sophomore self or your sophomore peers about these issues? What would it take to get to where you are to work on these things? I know what you did then, but how would you help them think about the time they have at Holy Cross?
Yeah, I think through my time at Holy Cross and, what drove me to work alongside you and Professor Jeff Reno on housing-related issues. And again, and this may sound cliche, but it really is identifying your passion early and then working within, all the amazing opportunities that you have at Holy Cross to cultivate that passion, right? And so for me, as a freshman and sophomore, the passion was, growing up in a foster care system, growing up in an environment where this idea of shelter and home and safe space was always quite fragile, and knowing that housing was an important part of everyone's lives, including mine, and then finding the avenues within Holy Cross. So for me, it was, becoming a member of the honors program to be able to actually to explore the housing question on a much more intellectual level. It was finding the right professors to conduct independent studies with, so that I could then, on a very close, intimate basis, really dive into the nuances of this housing question that I was so passionate about. I think by doing that at Holy Cross, and all the avenues are there at Holy Cross, it's just, of course, finding them, that then kind of allows you to take it to the next level once you're beyond the halls of Holy Cross, right? And I can't tell you how many times throughout my career I reached back to Holy Cross in some capacity, whether it be with you, Professor Landy, or whether it be with other professors there, to connect and to ask questions, and to also just to remind people at Holy Cross who helped me get to where I'm at today, remind them of how fruitful that experience was. So, that's kind of my experience that I, when I'm step back into being a sophomore or a freshman at Holy Cross, and what really kind of helped drive me to where I'm at today. And every step of the way, as I mentioned, whether it be the Fulbright, whether it be practicing law as a lawyer, whether it be now as a law professor and as a congressional candidate, you can see a direct trajectory line back to the work that I did intellectually at Holy Cross. And so
remarkably consistent on that, so I can vouch for that. So
yes, yeah. So I think that's a very, very important thing. I think we see this across the board with many other alumni as well. And so it's really a special place at Holy Cross to know that you're somewhere where 20, 30, 40 years from now, you're going to look back and say, wow, it started there in the sociology department or the political science department. So, and I don't think that's the case with every university or college, particularly someone who's at a major research university, which is great, University of Pittsburgh, but Holy Cross has a special niche for that type of career trajectory.
I know there'll be people glad to hear you say that, and I think we're all glad to learn from you. I'm really grateful for your passion, and I'm really glad to see where the intellectually how you've delved in and really developed on these. So thanks very much.